have our main presenters today. We have first we'll have Father John Chadwick to speak to us from his experience, and we've got Reverend Jonathan Herbert, who's also speaking from his background. If Chris is able to meet us, Chris McDonough has prepared some slides from the traveller's point of view, and Ivy has to be elsewhere today for very good reasons. So I will speak through Ivy's personal story, which she shared with us. I'll just read it from the screen when that comes up. So I'm delighted now to pass over to my colleagues. Please could everybody mute, because otherwise the microphones will pick up your sound. And if we forget to unmute when we speak, then please wave or shout or let us know. Does anybody have any questions before we start? No, okay. So may the Lord bless our time together. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so Gypsy, Roma and Traveller Churches. This reminds you of what we're here for, just in case you didn't know. And we're trying to promote, celebrate the engagement of churches across all denominations, and also work with other religious or secular groups who've got similar aims as ours. That's just to remind you who we are and what you're all part of, which is wonderful. Next slide, please. This is what we're going to cover today. And I'll just give you a minute or two to look at that. And now I'll hand over to John, who's going to start off speaking from his own experience. And I'm going to mute myself.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Nikki, for inviting me, and Paul and everybody inviting me to spend some time with you today. I am intending to use this time in two ways. One is just to give you a bit of an overview of my experience, which is of course limited to me, in the hope that it may resonate with some of you and your ministries. And then the second bit will be to really entertain any questions you have, because I think very often the dialogue is a great way to sort of impart information rather than just simply inputting. But to begin with, a bit about me, just in case you don't know who I am. John Chadwick, as you know, is my name, and I work with the Margaret Clitheroe Trust, which, among other things, seeks to provide support chaplaincy-wise for members of the communities. And my personal experience goes back nearly 30 years now, and I first came across Irish travellers, who are by far and away the biggest experience really is from the Irish traveller context. It's important to say that, and also from a Roman Catholic perspective, because I am a Catholic priest, although most recently I have supported and certainly colleagues have been involved in Romany Gypsy funeral, a couple recently of children, in fact, and those took place in the Church of England. So I'm delighted that kind of ecumenical flavour is really developing as God intends, clearly. But I think, my experience has been particularly, as I say, through the Irish traveller prism, if you like, and through the Roman Catholic tradition. My impression is, I don't know whether there are any Roman Catholics here today on the call, but my impression is that the Roman Catholic Church is somewhat behind other traditions, especially the Church of England, in recognising the need to reach out to members of the communities and to be there. I think there's I mean, it's right to say that MCT, Margaret Clitheroe Trust, only tends to get involved when there is a problem to address. So I suppose my view, my sort of insights are sort of come from that almost negative experience, if you like. We get involved because there's a problem with a local priest or a local parish. Generally speaking, I have found that there is a reluctance on the part of Roman Catholic parishes to reach out to Irish travellers in particular, and that shows itself in a number of different ways. There can be just a lack of engagement altogether, and when clergy are approached to assist a particular family in their hour of need, they just ignore it. But we have had instances of worse, sort of an even more negative experience, where priests felt the need to call the police when travellers attend Mass on a Sunday. And in fact, I know of a couple of occasions when arrests have taken place because the priest essentially said to the police that travellers were trespassers on the land of the church, which is completely outrageous, and it's unbelievable that such could happen, but it does. In turn, specifically in relation to funerals, there is a huge reluctance to serve Irish travellers in particular in the Roman Catholic context, because of the size of the funerals. They tend to be very large, and reflecting, of course, the huge respect given to the dead and to those who are bereaved as one of the most important, if not the most important, moment in life. And so huge numbers, and sometimes in the thousands, gathering naturally causes some concern and anxiety around for clergy especially. I've had an instance where there was well, it's all tragic, but the death of a little one is somewhat as another level, isn't it, really? And we had a case some years ago of just a 2-year-old who was tragically run over on the site that he lived with his parents and wider family members, and in fact he was run over by his own dad, which was just horrendous. And I ended up being involved in that funeral because the family and the funeral directors had approached, I think it was 4 different parishes in the Birmingham area where they wanted to have the funeral, and each one of those priests refused to accommodate the funeral of the child. And when I heard about this, I mean, although I was stationed at the time on the south coast, and that 4 different parishes had essentially rejected the child, naturally I had to step in. I mean, it was an outrageous situation, and so I drove up to Birmingham and met the family. I will never forget this, for reasons that will become apparent, but it was February, I seem to remember, and it was a very, very damp, cold and wet day, and I naively thought I might be welcome in one of the local churches, because I agreed to do the funeral, and I assumed from the funeral directors that I would be allowed to use one of those 4 churches to do it. But when I arrived, I discovered that not only had the family been rejected from the church, but those churches, but so had I. So we had to go straight to the cemetery, therefore, and I remember the weather was terrible, and a huge cemetery there in the south of Birmingham, and there was one of those very old cemetery chapels in the grounds, which hadn't been used for years. In fact, I don't think there was any electricity in there. But nevertheless, they opened this building up, and there was no electricity because we were in darkness. And I had a couple of candles, and I said to the the mother of the child, look, your son is going to get everything that he would have had otherwise, and we're not going to shorten anything, or he's going to be given all the respect, and we're going to pray to God and thanksgiving for his short life in exactly the same way we would have done had we been allowed to have been in a church. And I remember the image of just a couple of candles, which is on a like a picnic table, which I used as an altar, and the little blue coffin was laid on a rusty tea trolley. You just don't forget moments like that. And we eventually laid little lad to rest. But there's just one story of the kind of well, I was going to say discrimination, but it's worse than that, isn't it? It's almost hatred, really, that a so-called minister of the Lord and the community that he's part of, it's just unbelievable. It's almost impossible to believe that could happen, but obviously it did. And there have been numerous other incidents of parishes refusing to accommodate and to welcome travellers to bury the dead, for all the reasons I've just said. So, I mean, that's an extreme story, but is in the Roman Catholic context anyway, replicated far too often. I don't know at this point, are there any questions that anybody wants to ask me? Is this helpful, everyone?
Thank you, Father John. That was very helpful. Yes.
I mean, because I'm just conscious of, it's a very negative story to begin with, but I think for me, it really does illustrate the challenge that is out there. And there are, to be fair, there are some very practical aspects to Irish traveller funerals, and I'm sure there's some overlap as well with other communities as well. The size being the most obvious one. How do you accommodate so many people? I remember being conducting a funeral in Abingdon in Oxfordshire some years ago, and I don't think I would be exaggerating to say there were probably 2,000 people there. I mean, the church could fit about 300, and everybody else was outside before going up to the cemetery, which was a sort of 20-minute walk away. But the whole town came to a gridlock. I mean, people parked anywhere and everywhere to attend that funeral. And naively, perhaps, but with the best of intentions, a day or two before the funeral, I did approach the local police station just to say, look, this is going to be a large funeral, almost certainly. You may like to consider having maybe one or two officers available for traffic control and the like. What I didn't realise they would do would be setting up roadblocks around the ring road of Abingdon to prevent people attending the funeral. So mind-blowing in terms of a lack of understanding and respect, quite frankly, for those who've lost loved ones, regardless of ethnic background. It's completely relevant. But so I've never since contacted the police when I'm doing a traveller funeral, because I know they're going to misuse that information almost certainly. And instead of making an occasion as much as possible a harmonious one with wider civic society, it can set up almost a flashpoint for trouble as a result of that kind of discriminatory practice. So, there's a list of practical considerations. In an ideal world, it would make sense to contact the police, but as I say, I've never done so since because of that. which is incredibly sad, really, when you think about it. But again, from I think some of the experience I've had will be coloured by the fact, by the context of the Roman Catholic funeral liturgy, which can be a bit wordy and it can be a bit long as well, depending on who is celebrating what's often a requiem mass rather than a straightforward liturgy for a funeral. But I've just adopted sort of over the years a few maxims really in terms of planning and preparation. One is not to make it overly long, and far better to have one or two scripture, preferably one actually, scripture reading from one of the Gospels that really packs a punch in terms of the message, rather than ploughing through 3 or 4 different texts, which the official rite of Roman Catholic funeral requires. I just don't do that. It's not helpful. I don't think, at least for families. Far better just to really immerse ourselves in one text and preach on that briefly, because you will have with such a large group of people, lots of children, it might be a tad challenging just to keep everything flowing. So I think brevity is a good maxim, although more importantly than that is any liturgy needs to be honorable and reflect. It should be graceful, literally full of grace, shouldn't it? So we shouldn't be bound by times, but that's a general sort of maxim, though, as I say, is to try and keep it reasonably short, given that you've got huge numbers to accommodate going up to the cemetery. My experience, talking of that, has been the biggest part of the funeral liturgy will be the cemetery, the graveside. I don't think I've ever been to a crematorium with an Irish traveller family. I'm just trying to think. I think they're always burials. And my impression is that's a sort of communities wide tradition. But I bow to all of your experience if it's different to that. But you will have even more people coming to the graveside from the funerals I've officiated at than you would have at church. So it's a huge business, and there are some big logistical challenges when you have such a large crowd of people. One of which is just the sheer pressure of behind you. If you're standing at the graveside, you can easily find yourself almost in the grave because of the pressure of people behind you. Could be 20, 30 deep behind you, and it's a bit of a challenge to manage that. And on the odd occasion, I've just had to sort of shout out, please step back, people, because I'm almost in the grave. And again, there are a few traditions which happen that aren't at least written down in the rites of funerals. One is singing, impromptu singing at the graveside, which is absolutely beautiful. People come forward and sing a song, and this can go on for 20 minutes, an hour even, during the burial rite itself. I just find it utterly beautiful when that happens. Another sort of different tradition would be the men taking off their ties. There tend to be quite formal occasions, more formal than other sections of society, I would say, and the men take their ties off and throw them into the grave. That happens every time, and so it was a bit disconcerting the first time I did it, because I was feeling obviously ties were hitting my head and all the rest of it, because people who couldn't get near to the grave itself, they were just literally throwing them in the air. in the hope they land on in the grave. So things like that, which are, you know, distinctive elements of an Irish traveller funeral. I'm just trying to think of any other. In fact, music, yes, the playing of usually a car, actually, which precedes the hearse, usually a coupe or an open convertible kind of car, and they'll be playing music, often the favourite music of the deceased person, escorting the hearse to the graveside. That's quite normal, which obviously causes a bit of a stir for those who are tending the graves of loved ones during the time of the burial rite itself. People are a bit sort of, it's not the English way to do things, and you can see a few faces. But again, I think it's after a while you get used to. I think it's the most beautiful way to sort of honour the memory of a deceased loved one. And there's a sense in which you know, people, of course, they do care about everybody else, but there is a sort of a focus on the respect and the rites of respect and passage that are given to deceased members of the community, which override, frankly, everything else. And I think wider society may interpret that as a kind of a disrespectful thing to the wider community, but in fact it's the very opposite. It's about giving honor and respect to those who've died in a way that we all used to do 100 years ago. I mean, when you consider the practice, particularly the rural parts of the country, everybody used to close their shops, didn't they? You know, local died, everybody went to the funeral. That was the tradition. So in many respects, I think members of the communities are continuing the ancient tradition that we all did practice not so long ago, but we just all conveniently forgotten about it, and perhaps even have less respect than we once did for those who have died. All right, I'm conscious I've talked a lot there. I'm in the hope that maybe one or two resonances. Very happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, we do have general questions at the end, but Father John.
I see. Okay.
That's all right. But Father John needs to go probably before the end because of taking a funeral today, ironically. So
yes, I mean, it would be helpful for me to address any questions that you have now. Yeah, because I'll have to go just before 10, I think. Do I mean 10? No, I mean 11. No. Yes. Yeah. So over to you, anybody. Anybody's got a question? I can't see anybody's faces for some reason. Why is that? I don't know.
Betty has her hand raised.
Betty, hi.
Yeah, I do. I just wanted to say that you 100%. You got that 100%, Father John. Yeah, yeah, and you know, it was very moving as well. Thinking of that little baby on the rusty trolley, it got me very nostalgic. But yeah, you got that. I think the only other thing is you might have found people singing, which is mostly English funerals, I know, but sometimes the Irish, they do sing at funerals as well as the music. But yeah, that is 100% an Irish funeral, yeah. And yeah, I think you'll find that people, if they're in cemeteries, and we have, because I've been to quite a few large ones, not Irish, but English ones, and they're quite large. And people do tend to sort of stand back, or sometimes you see them sort of leaving the cemetery and perhaps coming back later. I think people have, you know, local people seem to have more respect than, like you say, than the police or sometimes the churches. It's very sad. Yeah.
Thank you, Betty. Are there any particular questions to Father John?
Yes, Martin. Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. I just wanted to thank Father John for his very moving account. Broke my heart completely to hear about the 2-year-old boy. And breaks my heart to hear of so many occasions when some of your colleagues have not accepted at all the Irish travellers coming into the Mass. It's so tragic to hear that. I just wanted to say something about the police briefly. My I totally understand why you felt you couldn't contact the police anymore following that terrible experience of them cutting off the travellers getting to the funeral. My experience has been a bit different to that. And if I can just say that on one occasion, when the police weren't contacted over here in Kent, in Sittingbourne, where the funeral, it was during the lockdown period and limited numbers, and the usual numbers turned up to a Romany funeral, and it resulted, because there wasn't control of the large numbers, it ended up in Paish's son Aaron being killed on the street, run over by a gorger, actually, who was out of control on his bike. And so when it came to, we did a lot of thinking about this, and when it came to Paish's son's funeral, he was 19, over in Cranbrook, and I was involved in the service there. We did contact the police, and they did a very, very good job of actually ordering the traffic of the town, and making sure everybody could get in and out safely. And I think personally, my own view is that we do need to involve the police and get them on side, so that a dialogue between the presiding priest, the funeral directors, and the police, maybe sometimes other groups as well, is important to prevent bad things happening.
Yeah, and I think up here we had a 2-year-old's funeral, which was very large in Darlington, but that was very well managed by the police, helping people know where to park and to move through and to keep things flowing. But it is difficult and delicate, isn't it? So thank you, Martin. Are there any other questions?
Jonathan,
just again, if I can come on with the police. In my experience in Dorset, they've usually been pretty good and seem to and want to respect the traditions of the travellers here. I had a funeral during lockdown, which the funeral directors were trying to get the daughter of the person who died to take responsibility if there were any breaking of COVID restrictions. I think there'd been a recent £10,000 fine to a funeral director up in the Midlands. So they were trying to pass on the responsibility to her. So I said to her, look, don't sign anything. You know, I'll let me talk to the police first. Unfortunately, I knew the superintendent, and he put me in touch with the inspector in Dorset, and I chatted to him and I said, look, there will be a lot of people there, but what I'll ask them to do is line the streets and line the sides of the cemeteries, but and it'll be the immediate family that are around the graveside, but it'll be more than 10 people because, you know, the immediate family in a, you know, in a kind of Romany family is much bigger than that, isn't it? And the police were kind of fine with that. And then, and the inspector said, you won't see anybody, but if you need us to come out, if anything gets out of hand, get in touch. I said, I'm sure it won't. Then the morning of the funeral, the chief inspector rings me up, and I thought, oh no, what's going to happen here? And he said, I'm just ringing to tell you that I know you're coming from Hillfield Friary, and there's a tree has fallen down on the road, so you need to take another route. He said, I'll be there in an unmarked car, but again, just let me know if anything goes wrong. And of course, people were terribly respectful, and we couldn't do the service in church because of COVID, but in fact, the chap we were burying had, you know, been horse-drawn for 50 years and then lived most of his life outdoors. So it was much more appropriate to do the liturgy outside. So, yeah, I mean, negotiation, if you can do it, is good. But I guess it does depend a lot on the police force, and it depends on relationships with the police. I mean, Betty's going to say something in a minute, I think. And the reason I was able to get in touch with the police and got the hotline to the inspector was really because of the work that people like Betty have been doing with Prejudice Free Dorset and building those relationships. So, yeah. Betty, you're going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to follow on, because this, what you're actually saying, Jonathan, is quite true. And this is what a lot of people we need to do nationally. It's, you know, it's all that relationships with the police. I mean, at the moment, we're getting quite a good relationship. But I know in Christchurch, as Father John Chadwick knows, that there was a young person there and the police were shutting all the pubs, etc. They did it to my father 23 years ago, and my father's born and bred in the town, and they still closed all the pubs, but luckily the Priory was actually full, is overflowing. But this is the thing, it is communication. And I think that, you know, if we can get chaplains in all areas, which I know is something that you've been doing, and, you know, to make those contacts. And also with the Irish travellers, sometimes it might be good to get, you know, some of the elders, like I think you did that, Father John, with Mr. Cash, didn't you? Didn't you get him to talk to the police, I think?
Well, it was no, Betty, you summarized it pretty accurately. I mean, it was a fairly negative experience, to be honest with you. And yeah, I think the police were in touch with the family, but in a quite a blunt way, with very little compassion, having just lost their son and their daughter, brother and sister.
Yeah.
Within a few months of each other, and it was really just to try and pin down where people are coming from, and I suspect they would have been trying to lift people en route to Christchurch for the funeral. I'm really pleased, Jonathan, to hear you talk about Dorset Police in a favourable, and you, Betty, too, in a favourable light, because that's really good news.
It's taken a while. It's taken
my
a while.
experience has been less than that, and I'm just wondering, actually, just hearing you talk, whether the police take a different line with Irish travellers than they would Romany Gypsy families, because I just haven't had that positive, and obviously Abingdon was Thames Valley Police, but I know Hampshire Police, for example, forces do vary hugely, are exemplary in my view. I mean some of the ways that they deal with families turning up temporarily in car parks and things like that have been really good practice. So much so I asked the Chief Constable there to share that with his colleagues in other forces, because it was a far more cost-effective way of dealing with everything, and also it produced nothing but harmony with the local community. Very good practice. But I think we're all agreed, I think, on the point about communication. It's like everything in life. If we communicate properly and clearly, great progress can be made in these things. And you know, we should never shy away from an opportunity to build bridges with the police, for obvious reasons. It benefits everyone. So, you know, I would be absolutely up for that. It's just that my experience of reaching out has backfired somewhat, and as I say, that may be peculiar to Irish travellers. I don't know, but just one other thing that comes to mind. Forgive the disjointed nature of this. Is about Irish, the sort of structure of an Irish traveller funeral, which may or may not, I don't know, fit also is duplicated in a Romany Gypsy funeral. I don't know, but basically there are 4 elements to it, typically, not always, but typically. The first element is the night before the funeral. So you would have I think in Ireland they call it the removal. Quite why, I don't know, but but over here we tend to call it reception of the body, or reception of the coffin into the church the night before, and there's a small ceremony that goes with that, and that can often be a very good occasion for people who are unable to make the following day to attend and to pay their respects, and typically very much dependent on the particular priest and the parish. But I would shut the church quite late at night, because a lot of people will come in just to say a prayer or whatever, just in a moment of quiet, and then lock the church, sort of, as I say, late night. And then you have the following day, the main funeral liturgy itself, very often the Requiem Mass, and then you have the third bit of it, which is the committal at the graveside, which, as I said a second ago, often is the biggest bit of it, attracting many more people. And then the fourth bit would be the wake, the celebration afterwards, which would usually occur at a hotel or restaurant, which would often has to be booked under different names to prevent the event being cancelled. But there's been loads of, in fact, I was involved in the Cash funeral there, Betty, you know, at Christchurch. There were two venues. I mean, the police went to, I think it was 2 days before the funeral, they visited every single cafe, pub, corner shop, off license. Every single one was visited, and basically were told to close for 2 days. And the reasoning behind that was to stop any traveller families that managed to get through the various sifting processes that were being set up, just to deter them from hanging around. So there was uproar. I had hate mail and local businesses saying to me that I was, you know, I'd lost them thousands of pounds worth of revenue because of the police had ordered them to shut, which of course they had no authority to do that. But nonetheless, that's what happened.
And they swear that they haven't ordered it. They swear they just informed them, because it happened to my father 23 years ago, and he's not an Irish traveller. He was and well known in the town. And what you say about Southampton, about Hampshire Police, that has come after many years of communications with them, and me passing stuff on to Traveller Movement, things they've done. So they've been taken. It's obviously paid off, because I have heard good reports of them in the last 2 or 3 years. So, so really it does help. And I was going to say, it is always advisable to get in touch with the local organisations such as Custibok, depending which area you're in, because sometimes, especially Jonathan, he will go out to the Irish travellers, or, we may even know them. We have some settled here now in this area, very nice people. So, so it does help. It does help to communicate. So we've got some work to do to get into all the police forces all over the country, really, and get them to modernise. Sorry.
No. It just occurs to me it might be worthwhile getting in touch with local chambers of commerce going forward as well, to talk about this whole issue with the police and have some sort of joint forum. I'm aware of the time.
Yes, and, absolutely. Thank you, everybody.
I really very much appreciate, John, what you were saying. And if I don't know, has Chris come? No. So Chris McDonald's not come. Is that right? For some reason. So that's okay. We have a little bit more time than we might have had. That might be Chris now phoning in. Jonathan, some of what you were saying overlaps to some degree with John Chadwick, and you have a bit more of a formal presentation, I know, with some slides with writing on them. But if I could ask you to take over now and perhaps step lightly on stuff that's already been covered by John Chadwick, and then add in other things, would that be helpful?
Sure. And I think there's lots of people here have got a lot of knowledge already, so let's leave time for discussion. So I'll aim to finish
So,
pretty much on 11. Yeah.
Just to remind you,
How's-
Paul will move on the slides for you if you ask him when to move on. And
Yep.
if there's anything on your slides that we've already heard, if we can, thank you. So the next slide is
Yeah, just to say, can you hear me, everybody? Yeah. Just to say, really how important graveyards and headstones are to the community. And I remember Roger Redding, my predecessor, saying to me, you know what, Jonathan, travellers will get more angry, more irate about problems with a gravestone than they will even about the, discrimination, the prejudice, the racism they suffer. Because, yeah, graveyards are incredibly important. And I guess for a nomadic people, or people who were nomadic, it's so hard for people to travel now these days. In a sense, the grave was the final resting place, was home. So yeah, graveyards terribly important. And for those involved with managing graveyards in churches, or those involved with families who are in conflict with local authorities, then yeah, we need to kind of attend to it. And when you do, it's so much appreciated by families. Next slide, please. Oh, that's Ivy's story. You're gonna,
yes, I'll just read that.
to us, Nikki. Thanks.
So this is what Ivy would say from her experience when her grandfather passed, and this was during the first COVID lockdown. It was very difficult for the family. They were a very close family, as we've heard. Her grandfather spent several weeks in hospital. They couldn't visit him, as we all know, because of the COVID restrictions. And he was a man who wasn't literate. He didn't know how to use a landline or a telephone. And the family were asked to say goodbye on an iPad, which is quite alien for him and distressing and not usual for the family. So that was upsetting and traumatizing. Her grandfather had no idea what an iPad was. And after he passed, they wanted to have him buried with his daughter. And years before, he bought 2 burial plots, and his daughters were buried in the plots. And the cemetery was very important to him, as we've heard, a very important place to visit and spend time. And all his family were there, and those family connections are deep. But when the funeral was being arranged, the undertaker said that the vicar of the cemetery refused to permit Grandad to be buried on top of one of his two daughters, because the cemetery had been closed and it wasn't used any longer. And this, of course, as we know, happens. Cemeteries do get closed by local authorities or by churches. So the family didn't understand what was going on, and they were trying to understand it. And they were trying to understand what their rights were as they purchased the burial plots many years before. And they tried to talk to the vicar, but they didn't have any success at all. And after not being successful, they had an alternative burial place. But this was upsetting because Ivy's nan had dementia and was frightened by the whole thing, and dementia and by this whole not burying where they wanted to. Excuse me. And the ordeal, excuse me, obviously reinforced, made the grief much worse than it would have been. This is Ivy's story. So back to you again, Jonathan. Excuse me. Jonathan, are you there?
Yes, next slide, please. Just to say, really the grief when somebody dies is intense, because family bonds are so strong, and people do live so close together. I mean, I'll perhaps go visit somebody and I'll be sitting in a trailer, and within like half an hour, 4 generations of that family have passed through that trailer. You know, even when families are separated by distance, you know, mothers and daughters will be speaking to each other 4 or 5 times a day on the phone. Yeah, so grief is felt very intensely by people, and funerals, as Father John said, are really big, are large. It's a shameful thing not to attend a funeral. So there's, as well as paying your respects to the dead, you need to pay respects to the family too. So yeah, huge events, and yeah, rather wonderful events. I kind of wish we had more pictures really to see the you know, the dignity, the procession, the imagination that's there. I remember Betty, you saying to me about the Queen's funeral. She said, Betty said to me, "Oh, it's really quite familiar." It was a bit like on a slightly even bigger scale, but rather like a traveller funeral, because we kind of regard all our people, our elders particularly, as kings, as queens, as royal people, and I think that's how it should be. Next one. Yeah, prior to the funeral, again, if the family knows somebody is dying, there'll be a lot of visitors. A lot of people will come again to make their farewell, and sometimes to make their peace with the person who is dying. And I know this has sometimes been a problem when people are in hospital. Generally, families will try to take care of people in the home, but if somebody needs to go into hospital, it can be a problem for the staff when dozens and dozens, even hundreds of people are trying to visit. What I suggest to NHS staff is really they find somebody in the family to negotiate with, somebody in the family who can say, look, let's arrange different times for different members of the family to come and visit. Let's try and space it out. And where hospitals understand this, they will often bend over backwards and bend the rules a little bit to allow people to see the dying, if they understand the importance of the extended family. Yeah, laying down the law, in my experience, well, I've never tried to do it, but I've seen other people try to do it with travellers. That doesn't tend to work very well. It's counterproductive. Negotiating, finding the right people, the people who are naturally leaders in the family. It might be an elder, it might be a younger person who people look to for leadership to negotiate with the settled community. What sudden death is really difficult for people in traveller communities, because they're not given that chance to be able to say goodbye. So yeah, bear in mind how hard that is. Next one, please. Arranging a funeral. It can be a bit chaotic if you go around to visit a house to visit the family, because more than likely the house will just be full of people seeking to support, seeking to pay their respects to the family. And as I said, people live in big extended families. And somebody said to me something about Romany gypsies and Irish travellers, which I've always found helpful. They said, remember, the culture is more Latino than British. So, you know, if people are talking loudly, if people are shouting, it's not that they're falling out with each other. It's just that that's kind of the way they are. So, but if you're trying to arrange a funeral service, well, I've learned it's good to just, again, nominate, you know, 3 or 4 people from the family, or just see 3 or 4 people at once, and maybe see another couple of people if you need to see them on another occasion. Because if you try to get, you know, 50 people to agree what's going to go on into the service, you'll end up with 25 different bits of music, you know. So try and keep it simple. And people love to have bits of music, often secular. Again, as Father John said, yeah, keep it simple. One reading, one scriptural reading is more than enough. And there may well be members of the family who want to stand up and read something, or somebody may want to get up and sing a favourite song of their granddad, for their granddad, for example. So yeah, the more people can be included, the better. Next, please. Yeah, sitting up, certainly in the Romany tradition, is really important. I always try and go round the night before the funeral to visit, perhaps be there to receive the body when it comes. In the Romany tradition, the body doesn't go to church the night before, it goes to the family home, and large numbers of people will gather for that. Traditionally, people will sit up. Traditionally, I think the women particularly will be providing food, providing tea for people. There's an opportunity for people. The body will be lying in a coffin or a casket, and people will be coming to, and the casket will be open. People will be coming to pay their respects. There'll usually be a fire outside, and the men tend to gravitate around the fire outside, and the women will be often indoors. And I always go and like to say some prayers over the body of the deceased. I think that's always helpful. Next one, please. Yeah, the funeral, the day of the funeral, there could well be an awful lot of people. So yeah, give yourself time. There'll be a long procession, and the procession may go to particular places. For example, if it's an older Romany gypsy, it may go to past places, the old stopping places where people stopped in the past, where they camped. Important not to rush the funeral. I said liaison with the police. Probably qualify that if you think you've got a good relationship with the police. And when you get to the church, just remember it's going to take ages for people to get in. There'll be people milling around. Not everybody will want to go into the church, even if there is room. And I remember, again, Roger Redding saying to me, if people are standing outside and don't come into church, don't take that, you know, as an insult. They trust you. You know, travelers come from a nomadic tradition. They trust you as the shaman or as the priest to do the religious business for them. Yeah, again, make sure prayers are simple, are understandable, and in the homily that the dead are, the deceased is honoured. Just like any funeral, I guess. Photos of the deceased, if they can be shown, that's great. I've been to funerals where there's been a kind of running loop, a slideshow showing the deceased, you know, throughout their life, whether short or long, and that seems to be particularly important, and I guess really brings the person into the room. Next one, please. Yeah, there'll be a lot of flowers at the graveside, incredibly intricate displays. Yeah, incredible what you see. There may be wagons made out of flowers, wheels made out of flowers, a packet of embassy cigarettes that the deceased smoked, you know, a favourite armchair, all sorts. I remember when Dave Rawlings died, in his funeral, because he'd met Eileen Rawlings on his push bike, and the dog had bitten him, and that's how he got to talk to family and meet her. There was a bicycle, a push bike, which was covered in flowers for him. Yeah, and again, as John said, flowers were thrown into graves, ties, all sorts of other things sometimes. The family may fill in the grave themselves, and yes, people will sing at the graveside. Next one, please. Importance of graves. Because the family bonds are so intense, there's a real desire for people to be buried next to each other, and people try to ensure this by buying plots well in advance, and people will keep returning to the grave, and people will set up benches by the grave because they visit so often, or people will bring chairs, and people will bring flowers. You can tell a graveyard where there are a lot of traveller graves in, because the graves will be kept immaculately, and often there'll be silk flowers there. If you were to go through the village of Coombe Bissett, you can immediately from the road spot loads of traveller graves there. Next one, please. Yeah, gravestones. People do get into conflict with churches, with cemeteries, and it's partly to do with the desire for families to really honour the dead by having the best possible gravestone they can. So it's really important, if you manage a graveyard, to be really clear with families around any restrictions there are. And I can't really reiterate that enough. And we're trying to train local town councils to do that more and more, because sending people, you know, an email with an attachment of the rules won't work for people who, some people won't be literate, some people won't be highly literate, and the whole traveller culture is so much built on relationship. So if you can, yes, speak with people, go through it in front of them, That's far more effective than just giving people a bit of paper. And of course, you've got to remember, people are grieving and still grieving maybe months later when they're discussing about headstones. Yeah, there are lots of conflict, and I think there's a real cultural ignorance amongst local authorities. So again, the more education, the more communication we can do with people who manage graveyards, the better. Okay, next one, please. I think Father John's told us most of that, really. Yeah, and I was interested to see the difference between kind of Romany communities with the body being taken to church the night before, whereas in the Romany tradition it would be in the home. Next one, please. Yeah, just a few tips. Listen patiently, let the family tell their story and the significance of the burial place to them. Yeah, really important. People come to you, pray with them, you know. That's so important, to make the link between the living and the dead. And yeah, if you have a graveyard, again, take the time to explain things to people. And again, keep calm if people are upset, and when you need to explain particular restraints on a graveyard, but be really, really clear about the policy you have. And if people do get upset and take offence, always you have to bear in mind that people are coming from a background of centuries of persecution, and you know, and are living with intense discrimination and racism today. Next one, please. Are we there with the next one? Oh, sorry. Yes, I've got it. Consider you might be able to make some exceptions because of particular ethnic and pastoral needs. You know, it might not be able to put up a really big memorial because of health and safety fears, but it may be possible to allow, you know, carving inlaid into a stone or a different coloured stone. Yeah, if your churchyard can't meet people's needs for graves, maybe there is a public cemetery that things are less restricted. I know in Somerset we're looking at negotiating an area, negotiating policy which puts traveller graves in a specific area, which will allow for people to put in curbstones. Curbstones are really important to around traveller graves, because people do not want people walking on the grave of their loved ones, the dearly departed ones. They really do not. That's an absolute no-no. And where curbstones aren't allowed, you'll often see that people will put on pots full of flowers or other things. That's to honour the dead, but also to prevent people walking on them or mowing them. Really, local authorities need to know that they never need to mow a grave, because they're so well kept by the families. I think that's it now. Can we go back to face, please? So
Yeah, have we gone through all the slides? Have we gone
think
through
so.
Chris's slides as well?
we have, yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. So it's open up really to question and answers. Just one thing there, Jonathan, that you had on your last slide is about helping people after the death with all the massive amounts of paperwork that can hit them, especially these people that may not be particularly literate. We perhaps all know what it's like after a death, all the stuff you have to do. And if you put yourself in the shoes of people who are not used to engaging with officialdom and may not be able to read, it can be overwhelming. So open access now to speakers. Father John has gone, and I'd like to very much thank him on behalf of all of us. He's gone to the funeral, but please do, let's open the forum now for everybody.
I will say something. Yeah, I thought, yeah, you've learned quite a lot, Jonathan. Yeah, spot on. Yeah, really proud to listen to that. Yeah, there's just one thing that, a bit of advice is when travellers are in hospital, and I know that Bournemouth do this most of the time, but they have got outside space. And sometimes they will, they'll make some space outside where the family can go. And then they, as you say, they have nominated people that carries backwards and forwards. So, I mean, that is another thing. I know that we started some work with the hospitals a few years ago, but then with all the changes in staff and all the different commissions, etc., I think that all went by the by. But yeah, I mean, that is a good point to try and get some, sort of enclosed space where people can go, because yeah, it's no good saying that we all flock, Irish travellers, Romany travellers, they just flock straight there. But yeah, I was quite proud to listen to that. Thank you.
That's a great tip, because travellers will probably prefer being outdoors as well, won't they?
Just one little thing. Forgive me, Jonathan, if you already mentioned this in your presentation, but my experience has been that the Romanies always want to follow the coffin into the church for the ceremony. So I remember one occasion when it was pouring with rain in Cranbrook, and I was trying to get people to come in because they had no rain gear at all. And they were just getting soaked out there. But they said, no, we're going to follow the coffin in as we always do. I think that's worth remembering. Another thing that always impressed me so deeply was that the considerable cost of a funeral are usually spread across the relatives, and they all chip in to make often very lavish funerals possible. It's not, the costs are shared by the relatives, also for weddings as well.
Yeah, while we're mentioning that, I had to deal with a case early on where a young woman was, on behalf of the family, was dealing with the undertakers, and the undertakers were wanting the money all up front, and she couldn't do that, and the family couldn't do that, and there was this impasse, and it had been 3 weeks, and I got phoned after 3 weeks, the night before the council were going to come and take the body and do a council funeral, but on the basis of health and hygiene, which would have been a cremation. And we were able to think of a way through, which was we were able to identify a fund which would give the undertakers the money they needed. This was just the night before, as an anonymous donation. So we weren't sort of feeling that we were setting up the priest in this case to feel that he would always have to find money. And then that released the undertakers to be able to do what they did. And as it turns out, there were huge pastoral issues that the lead undertaker was experiencing, which didn't help. And then it was very important to the family that they would pay back that money. And they did pay back that money, but they could only pay it in over installments. But the perception was that the undertakers thought that these people were wanting to do something and not pay for it. And the distress the girl was in was described as almost psychotic. She wasn't. She was just extremely distressed because she was trying to sort something out for the family and unable to do it. And the family were all looking to her, and they were saying, "Oh, but there's a man in a big car outside, and we think they're exploiting her. We think they're just bringing her in to use." So it was all perceptions, because it was her right and purpose to do it. Her husband was supporting her and staying in the car because the family had agreed she'd do it. She was so distressed that she was incoherent because she couldn't argue. And then they kind of undertakers' perceptions. But once it was released with this gift that turned out to be a loan, everything could happen. But it was just belief that people were going to do them down. So I think sometimes that factors in, paying bills.
I think there's not, well, I don't know any Romany people, because to pay for a funeral, if they didn't pay for a funeral, that would be a huge shame on any Romany family. In fact, I've had that happen to someone quite close to me, and the funeral wasn't paid for. It was a non-traveller who took charge of the money, had the money, and it's a huge shame on that person. They have finally paid it. But I can assure you, that's something, if ever you talk to the undertakers, let it be known that that is one thing that they're really, it would be a huge shame. And it would be like the body was not going to heaven. It would be awful if they didn't pay. I can assure you. They may not be able to pay up front, but they will certainly make sure that they do pay it. Yeah.
I mean, there are trusted undertakers, aren't there, who people go to because they know they do a traveller funeral. And I'm trying to think, talking with the undertakers, they quite often, they really enjoy the traveller funerals because of the pomp,
Pomp and ceremony,
ceremony, and they probably make more out of them as well.
But they usually invite you back to the wake as well. Yeah. Very interesting.
Do people have any questions they'd like to ask or comments? Yeah, Charlotte. You need to unmute.
Yeah. Hi. I was wondering if you know the role of the children in the grieving process, because I know sometimes schools aren't sympathetic to the children not attending when they're part of the grieving process on the camps. And a school that Martin Borrow and I are involved in, their head teacher, fortunately, is very sympathetic to that. But I know other schools can demand, because of attendance, that they need to attend school rather than be at home mourning with the rest of the site. You got any advice on that?
Is that something Betty can comment on?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, I mean, my daughter won't allow her children to attend funerals, but then it's different. She's not on a site. When children are on a site, it's very much around them. And, for the, it's an individual thing really, but you can imagine on a site and that all that grief is around them. Some parents might think it best to send the children to school, but some might feel that, if the children go, that they will be thinking of their loved ones and be sad. So I've got mixed feelings on that one. It depends on whether it's on a site. Yeah, perhaps Abby can come in on that one.
Hi, my name's Abby. I work for Kushtibok as an advocacy worker. I work with Jonathan and Betty. I just had a quick Google of the T code, which is what's used in schools, the Traveller's Code. Really it's in place. I can put a link in the chat if there is. It's in place really to allow Children to receive education if their parents are traveling. So schools have a duty of care to legally to provide education packs and things that are accessible to that family. And the footnote on this, because I thought it said something on the T code, because I've been working on it quite a lot recently. And it does say on the T code that schools should be promoting an inclusive ethos and to be mindful that Gypsy, Roma and Traveller weddings and funerals can last longer than usual, and so cultural discretion might need to be considered when recording attendance or absence.
Excellent, that's really helpful, thank you. I didn't know about that.
If you can put that,
I'll pop a link.
yeah, and then we can record that, Paul, can't we, for everybody?
Yeah, it is worth, you know, communicating with the schools and telling them that. I mean, my daughter is away at a festival at the moment and she can't get back, so I've had to email the school because they're stuck in a field, so they just can't get back. There's no way. And the school are very good. They have allowed them the one day, Thursday, but they didn't. They thought they'd be back in school today, but I'm sure that they, you know, that they will be amenable about it. So it does depend on the school.
Does anybody have any more comments or questions? Thomas Acton, I see you're there. I don't know if there's anything we've forgotten that you know from your extensive research you'd like to remind us of or tell us.
No, I was just thinking earlier when John spoke about singing at the graveside amongst Irish travellers, and I think the growth of funerals led by Romany Pentecostal clergy, especially from the Life and Life mission, has led to a great increase of singing at the graveside amongst English Romanis, because I think the Pentecostal fervour has kind of licensed people to sing more. And I can remember a number of Pentecostal funerals. Still, again, lots of burials, not so many cremations, but some, and singing, both extended singing sessions, usually of spiritual music or spiritually relevant secular songs, and then the singing of hymns by really accomplished singers at the graveside. Intensely moving that can be. So I think in many ways, one of the legacies of the great Pentecostal movement amongst Gypsies, Traveller and Roma in our lifetime is an undamming of the music across worship generally. It's like General Booth, no such thing as the devil's music. It can all be made to serve the Lord, but especially at funerals. I suppose I'd just like to say that one of the best funeral preachers I've ever come across is Fred Scarrett of the Light and Life mission. Usually preached in broad Cockney, absolutely serious Cockney, which gets people in London, or East London it does, together with little bits of Romany, but and I think he's one of the most startlingly moving and seizing the moment to witness funeral preachers I've ever come across.
Thank you. Maybe you could leave his name in the chat.
Fred Scarrett.
Yes, thank you.
I mean,
On that, yeah, on that note that we've said about cremation versus funeral, somebody explained to me recently that there is a belief amongst some of the communities, which may or may not you may or may not confirm that it takes a while for the soul and the body to separate. And it can take, some believe, up to a year. So if you have a cremation, then you may be prematurely separating the spirit from the body. Some folk believe, it may not be everybody, but just to bear in mind the importance of burial rather than cremation may be to do with that route. Martin.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about the Roma, distinct from the English Romanes and the Irish travellers, having worked quite a lot with the Roma community in Luton. So we had very tragic death of some babies, Roma babies, shortly after I began my work with them, and I facilitated the funeral for them in Luton. And when it came to going to the graveside, having been in the chapel, that they suddenly, the family suddenly said to me, "Why are you not singing? Why are you not singing?" So I opened my mouth and just started to sing whatever came out, really, and they seemed happy with that. And the reason was, I found out much later, was that these weren't Pentecostals. These families, they were from a nominal Orthodox, Romanian Orthodox background, and in such funerals as those, the priest, the Orthodox priest, in all his regalia and everything, will always sing at the right through the whole process, and is expected to sing chants at the grave too. The other thing to say from the Roma is that with the Pentecostals, as so helpfully Thomas was explaining, the Pentecostal funerals are enormous occasions of celebration of the life of a person, as well as the grief and being expressed profoundly too. Generally, when a Roma person dies, and remember there's 250,000 here in the country, this is happening a lot. When somebody dies, they usually want to be taken back to their home country to be buried there. The whole village then will join in from where they've come from. Yeah, and I think one needs to be aware of that. And the logistics around getting the body back home can be very, very tricky indeed. Paul, maybe you could add something to that from your experience with the Roma.
I think Father Leonard also had his finger up there.
Yeah, just very briefly, so there's no confusion. There's nothing special about an Orthodox priest singing. It's not because the Romanis or anybody else might like it. All our services are chanted. We sing everything, start to finish. Okay. God bless.
Thank you, Father Leonard. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Paul, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I don't think so. I think Martin covered the things that I'd thought of. But yeah, just to emphasize, a lot of families that we know of who have lost someone, they do go back to country of origin. And so that can be especially during COVID times, was a bit of a rigmarole.
Very expensive, I should imagine. Quite a financial burden on families.
Yeah, and again, like every extended family, then all do go back, which then can, like was also mentioned earlier, give problems with schools, either with children going back, or I've had it before when children have remained but have not attended school because they've had to go and stay with somebody else.
We are at the end of our time.
Can I just, there is a question in the chat from Kate Brooke. She said she's not able to talk to us now, but she said in prisons only immediate family may attend funerals, i.e. parents, children, siblings and partners. The use of live stream has helped hugely, but those from a traveller background feel desperately excluded. Any words of wisdom for this context?
That is really important, isn't it, for us to think about maybe, and we have a prisons chaplains group that's growing, and maybe we need to do some work thinking about that.
I've had occasion where I've tried to get, you know, one of the grandchildren to come. You know, the child had been brought up by the grandmother, but so I wrote to the governor, but they wouldn't flinch on it. They wouldn't they wouldn't allow, which was a shame. But what we did do, we got in touch with the hospital chaplain, and at the time of the funeral, they went, and the hospital chaplain at least went and prayed with the person, and they lit a candle, and that was at least something. Yeah.
That's right, Martin. I'd heard of that before. Sorry, Jonathan, where somebody's bought in, because you can't receive the body, which is really important. They bought in possessions that were attached to the person to have the night before with them. So there's some connection, and being with, and candles is a bit of a difficult one in prisons, but maybe electric candles can be permitted. Sorry, excuse me. Oh, you do candles, Kate. Brilliant. Wonderful. So candles are possible.
Just to say about new traveller funerals, I've only ever really done one, and it was quite important. The person wasn't a Christian, but so I suppose I did a fairly secular funeral, but made it quite earth-based, if you know what I mean. Creation-based, yeah. And that was important to do, really. And that was a cremation. But
we have kind of used up the agreed time. We can carry on if people want to, but I would like to very much thank everyone for being here today and sharing in this, and particularly thank the people who've taken time to prepare the talk for us and share their personal experiences. Personally, I found it very rich, and thank you for coming, and thank you particularly for people from the community being here, or communities, Abby and Betty. Your insights have been rich and helpful to us. Does anybody want to say anything before we end formally?
No, just thank you.
No, thank you all for being here today, and thank you, Paul, for facilitating it so well for us. Yeah. Paul, I'll perhaps catch you in a minute when we. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.